Okay, so our second paper for today is the collective intelligence genome. It shows the results of some research developed by Malone and colleagues at the MIT. I'm aware that the version you have in your hands there is the 2009 version, which is available on the web. I have the 2010 MIT's Law Management Review paper, which is basically the same. Eventually, some of the figures have different numbers. My version looks a little nicer, but it's only because you have the open source version. I have the paid version here, let's say. But it's basically the same thing.
Comparison because they sell collective intelligence, but I forget the word. It's called.
They charge.
They charge for it.
Yeah, well, it's not that the authors are charging. This is in a journal, and journals still have this model. In fact, this was something else that I was talking yesterday with Ned Koch during the interview. He was saying, researchers in Latin America are usually much more creative than researchers in our traditional, let's say, developed communities or scientific communities, because you have to deal with lack of money, lack of resources. And one of the things that we do here is, in fact, most our journals, the Brazilian journals, are free. And in fact, if they're not free, they may even have a paper form that is charged or something, but they always have a free version online. Otherwise, when those journals are assessed by CNPq to decide, well, to include them in the Qualis system and say how they should be ranked, they are not assessed, right? So at least we have the option in Brazil of publishing our research in ways that everyone will have free access to it. This doesn't happen in other places.
I was surfing the site, the blog of Pierre days, and he put many things
Free.
for free.
No, one thing that happens.
Very coherent.
Yeah, in many instances, researchers have the right. Depends on the agreement that they have with their publishers. Many times they have the right of having a copy, at least a draft copy of their work in their websites, and many do that so that students and researchers that do not have access to their papers and are not willing to pay $20 for each, that is usually what the rates that you get a paper like this if you go straight to the website of the journal. They're allowed to do that, but all of that to say that it's not Malone's fault that someone charges for the papers he wrote. I myself always have mixed feelings about this. It would be good for us Brazilian researchers to be published in let's say, in the better known international journals, but as many of them charge to be read, I myself feel that working on a public university, it doesn't make much sense that my work at the end has to be paid even by my university to have access to it again, right? So it's not that I'm so radical about it. I'm currently writing a few papers in which I'm not the main author, and then I allow whoever is the main author to decide where it's going to be published. So it's not that you're never going to see a paper that I am one of the authors in one of these journals, but by principle I do not, if I am the one who's taking the decision, it's not going to be published if it's not open source. But I guess this is something that we can still do here in Brazil. It doesn't affect, at least it doesn't affect my generation of researchers as much as it does affect Tiago's already, right? Tiago may not have that option. He may have to go for for the top journals, even if that eventually doesn't make much sense with the respect of who's paying and who's getting the benefits. But in my case, I think that I was lucky enough to get here a few years earlier when that was not so important, and now for me it is definitely not important at all. So so you will not have that kind of problem. Besides, of course, there is another reason not to publish in very well-ranked journals. Sometimes there is a lot of effort that you have to put into this to be accepted, and many times we think, okay, my idea is not complete yet, but I think it's already worth pushing it to other people so that we can keep our collective intelligence going, right? I don't want to wait for 2, 3, 4 years until I can get published, and I don't want to keep putting a lot of effort into this version of the work. I want to move on to something else, and maybe that's again what Ned Koch was saying, that makes us eventually more creative, even if we can't be as perfect, as precise in what we do, because we are allowed to move on, because we don't have to, keep there fighting against reviewers and editors for the rest of our lives, just for that paper, that if we have it published in that specific journal, that will allow us to have tenure. Tenure is stability in the North American universities, or that will allow us to have a good career, right? Fortunately, we're still not there. But anyway, in this paper, the collective intelligence genome, I think my impression is that the authors were very inspired. This is one of those papers that help you structure your mind to think about possibilities for collective intelligence to happen. And in fact, when we tried here when I said, try to think of a business or of any other sort of human initiative that uses the principles of collective intelligence, and try to figure out what the genes for that are, you found you could do that easily, because the ideas are simple, they make sense to us. It doesn't mean that they didn't have to do a lot of research beforehand to get to this. Many times when I say that it's more inspiration than transpiration, I may not be fair here. The text may be inspirational, but to get to simplicity, many times we need to work on complex things to make them simple, right? This is probably to some extent the case here. They assessed hundreds of cases of organizations that they thought were using collective intelligence principles, and found out that they all based their functioning in a few, what they call here, genes, that when put together in a correct way, allow for success of this kind of initiatives, and that eventually, if put in not in such a proper way, may lead to failure, right? Of course, the paper and the authors acknowledge that still depicts a few genes that would comprise this genome of collective intelligence. They think that there is still work to be done. They're not considering that they gave us the holy grail of collective intelligence, that everything that we need to know is on the genes that they detected. But it's a first step, and I think it's an inspiring step for whoever wants to work in this area. There's surely lots of possible ways of improving or refining ideas that are contained in this paper, and definitely the money, love, or glory categories are a very easy, though basic, but very easy way of us to think of what motivates people to get engaged in collective ventures. Right? Um, the the companies that they mention many companies, but a few of them get more highlights, get the highlights here in the paper. One of them is Threadless, that he considered less well known. I don't know how many of you already knew of this company, but you probably many of you know of a clone of it that exists in Brazil for quite a while already, which is Camiseteria. Right? Camiseteria clones the model of this American company, and is a very good example of collective intelligence. In fact, remind me afterwards to include in our, it's probably going to be the only text that we'll have in our Moodle page, to include this paper by two, I guess a professor and a master student in Rio de Janeiro, that have worked on, that have studied camiseteria and have depicted the ways in which camiseteria used its customers to perform most of its work. So in a clear example of crowdsourcing and crowdfunding and crowd whatever you think that could happen inside an organization, right? That company, this Brazilian company, based its original concepts on the American counterparts. The authors also discuss Wikipedia, right, which is a fine example of collective intelligence. And then they notice that there are some collective intelligence ventures in which what is important is aggregation. In fact, Wikipedia is one of those, right? The more people you get involved, the more articles or the more items, entries will be included in that encyclopedia. If we think of what Diderot and D'Alembert did in France some 300 years ago, it was whole lives spent on trying to organize an encyclopedia. Wikipedia has been there for, a little more than a decade now, and already includes much more information than any of the previously existing encyclopedia, and with a level of correctness that is, let's say, amazing, and that would be considered very improbable for many people if we hadn't seen it, if we hadn't used it as we do these days. What made it possible? Each one does a little bit of the job, and the job of all the contributors is then aggregated. In this case, it's not a case of selecting the best work. It's including all of them, but then checking if they are correct. If they're not correct, reviewing them and improving them so that they become better. For me, it is still interesting that we see very little graffiti on Wikipedia. When I say graffiti here, it's people trying to sabotage. If sabotagers are in every other aspect of our lives, why don't we see it at least as clearly on Wikipedia? Probably because they've built a structure that prevents that to happen, or at least that solves the situations in which sabotage occurs more efficiently than we do in other aspects of our lives, right? Right now I have a student in undergraduate studies that is doing some, it's not really ethnographic study, but who became a member of the Wikipedia group in order to try and understand more clearly how it all works. But Well, this is again another interesting example that was used here for Malone, from Malone and his colleagues to discuss the topic. They mention here, you've probably all heard of those, of that 5W plus 1H or something. Here they have the 3W plus 1H. They say that we should ask a few questions in order to understand how collective intelligence or collective intelligence building blocks can be put together. What is being done? So that's one of the W's. Who is doing it? Why are they doing it? And how is it being done? If we consider those three W's and the last H together, they claim that we are able to understand what or how things happen, and eventually make sure that they happen in a way that they lead to the desired objectives. So pages here sort of glued together. So the genes create and decide. I find it interesting here that they're talking about the genome, and then create and decide are already mentioned, at least to, if I'm thinking it right, they're already mentioned as being genes, right? But then one of the things that is a little strange to me is that you have genes and then you have genes inside genes, because for create, how you do create, you create using some genes that will be proposed later. How you decide using other genes. So I think there is still room for refinement here, if I understood it right, that this is how they're calling these things. Is that the impression that you had as well? I mean, I read it once. I didn't go a second time there to check if create, when they talk about create and decide, if they're talking about that, saying that those are genes already. They're the create gene and the decide gene. No? Eventually that was just my... Okay, maybe that's just my reading. So let's not be unfair with the authors here. But anyway, they say that these two things have to be there. And it makes sense that creation and decision are both there, because if there is someone creating something, which means actually putting an effort into doing something, there has to be afterwards someone, eventually even the same crowd, but eventually a hierarchy, or that will decide what to do with what was created, and eventually making it available again to the crowd. So there's this very nice table in which for each one of those questions, the who, why, how, and how is split into how create and how to decide. There's this table in which the authors explain each one of the genes involved. For example, who, it could be the crowd, or it could be hierarchy, right? Just remember that another organization or another project that is discussed a lot here in the paper is Linux. And for example, in Linux, the crowd develops the system, but there is a hierarchy of people that are closer to Linus Torvalds, the original proposer of this community, let's say, who will decide what part of that development will be included in what they call the core of the operating system, right? Why? What are the genes for why? Money, love, and glory. How? And when we think about how to create, we can create things by collection. Wikipedia does collection. We will use collection anytime aggregation is what makes something better than what we had before, right? So that's typically a situation in which crowds are very effective, because each one does a little bit, and the whole is very, the whole becomes something really relevant and important to to whoever is going to benefit from it. It could be the crowd itself. It could be eventually in a more profit-oriented business or venture. It could be someone, eventually even the shareholders of a company, right? It has to be clear for us, and this is not something that is very important for the paper itself, but it's important for us who are studying collective intelligence, that those who perform the collective intelligence tasks, or those who are collectively intelligent, are not necessarily the same ones that will benefit from the results of that collective intelligence effort, right? This is why I usually say that we could and we should, I think we should embrace collective intelligence projects that empower the people, and we should be a little skeptical about collective intelligence efforts that empower an external entity in a situation where some do the work and others get the benefits. Okay? But it's collective intelligence is there for everything. There will be clever people trying to use collective intelligence for the good of society in general. There are others that are more focused on their own interests that will think of ways of harnessing that collective intelligence for their own and sole benefits, right? So how to create a collection contest. Contest is when it's still there is. It seems that there is a collection to some extent, and then there's a competition between those items that were collected. Only a few will survive. Eventually, only one will survive. The best idea, for example. And collaboration. This is a more complex situation in which the result depends on the interaction of users and not necessarily only on them doing their work alone and having that work aggregated afterwards. How to decide? Group decision, which can happen in several different ways. They mention here voting, averaging, consensus, reaching a consensus, prediction market. Today Pietro is not here with us. Last class he was asking me to discuss a paper that we ended up not discussing. I promised we would do it today. I'm happy that he's not here because we will not have time to do that. But prediction market is another way of doing these group decisions or individual decisions. Individual decisions can again be market or social network. Okay. In my version of the paper here, I have this picture of Linus Torvalds that you don't have in yours, but it doesn't make any difference for the paper.
Moodle is back.
Pardon?
Moodle is back.
Moodle is back. Okay, we'll get to Moodle soon. Yeah, I guess then most of the paper he's detailing what happened in that nice table that we just discussed, and then I think another interesting scheme is the one presented on page 28 of the version that I have here. That is where they use a drawing to show what, who, why, and how those companies that were discussed here in the paper, specifically Wikipedia, Innocentive, and Threadless, use the genes to make sure that their initiatives work the way they planned. In fact, those are the drawings that I wanted you to replicate in your analysis of the items that you chose for the exercise that I proposed to you on a Moodle. I guess those are the main ideas of the paper. I'm sure I'm not being fair to all the, let's say, the inspiration of the authors, but I think we've discussed some of the main points. I don't know if you want, if you have anything else that you want to mention or highlight in this paper before we go back to our Moodle and discuss Surf Couch and some of the other initiatives that you pointed out as being interesting to analyze or to use this genome scheme to analyze. Anything related to the paper?
I think in comparison that they can, these genes can have a lot of combinations.
Yeah, this is what I think. This is why this is an inspiring paper, because genes can combine in different ways, and depending on the ways they combine, they will result in individuals, let's say, that are different, right?
Some kind of societies, they will have different kinds of combination depending on the culture and
it will surely, it's surely dependent on, let's say, some cultures or some countries or some cities may find it easier to use some of these genes because those genes are more available in their culture than others. There's a lot that we can explore here. It's a model, right? And it's not even a complete model. The authors say that they don't intend to have a complete mapping of the genome of collective intelligence, which means that there is a lot of room still to keep further developing even the idea, the concept of genes as a metaphor to what we have to, a metaphor to the building blocks that we need to put in place so that a collective intelligence initiative works fine. But it's, as I said, as any good model, it's simple enough for us to, after having read it, already think of organizations or think of initiatives that we believe that have collective intelligence as its inspiring way, and map that and say, oh, now I understand this is what they do. In this case, they are using aggregation as a way of creating, but then after aggregating that, they use some sort of hierarchy to decide on eventual items that will be kept out of the aggregation as a whole.
And this can be used for both good and evil. Yesterday I saw a meme that was very that made me think about this. I think the name in English is Look Who Is Back. It's a site,
fun. They're trying to make fun of.
Yes, it's a German group who put Hitler back in the 21st century and make how he would be accepted in our society today. And he put this of the many of technological things that including Wikipedia that you are studying here. And wow, for me it was wow.
Yeah, and think
very bad.
I am sure. Well, I'm not sure if in our recording here, if whoever is with us from a distance will have heard what Rafaela just said, but she was concerned about a movie that, well, she's saying that all of this can be used for the good or the bad, for good or evil, and she's completely right. It's our challenge as a society to use the technologies that we develop for the good, but yeah, we have to be very critical about it. In fact, I'm sure, again, going back to what Rafaela just said, that if Hitler was back, he would surely find a social network that would take him easily, and in fact would be very happy with his ideas, and where his ideas would not sound any bad at all.
Yeah. Propaganda.
But at the same time, considering that now we all have a voice, I think we should entitle people the right to have their voice. I think even ideas that are not popular and that don't seem right to us, they deserve the right to be expressed. I don't accept any longer that we discuss what is politically incorrect, or this is politically incorrect, it can't be discussed. I think we should discuss, and the only way, ideas have to be discussed. Actions have to be condemned, or if they are, you know, again, even prejudgment or preconceived ideas. Each time I reflect about that, I think we all decide and we do things based on our preconceived ideas. Preconceived ideas are ideas that have already been thought, and by us or by others, but they're there. So we're taking our decisions based on ideas that we have in our minds. I think we should be aware that some of them have to be reassessed from time to time, but we shouldn't be prevented from having our preconceived ideas, because preconceived ideas are ideas that came from others that considered them beforehand, our parents, our grandparents, I think our culture. And when we agreed and we prevent our preconceived ideas to be discussed, we become the hostages of new ideas with which we are not, at least we're not yet completely satisfied with. So I think ideas have to be expressed, regardless of if we like them or we don't like them. And ideas are there to be argued against, not prohibited, right?
Yes.
So, but again, there is a huge risk there. It's dangerous. But again, now we are crowds, and what we have to do is we have to, as crowds, we have to be each time more flexible. We have to be flexible to understand that there are different ways of perceiving things. We should try to build and educate our society in a way that we become flexible, not flexible to accept, to understand the difference, more than accept the difference the way we have been accepting, right? There are things that we say, okay, I understand that this happens. My actions will never put whoever thinks that way or acts that way in a situation where I mean, they can't live their lives because they have their rights to do that. But I cannot and I should not be prevented from saying that I'm not good with that. I don't accept that, and I don't take that as being the ideas to govern us only because someone said that that's politically correct. Right? But anyway, that's too philosophical for our class, and we still need this half an hour that we have to go back to couch surfing and some of the other ideas that you have there. So I will stop this recording here and we'll go back to our Moodle.